So I came across this article earlier today, and I thought that this came at the right time because I had already planned on making a video discussing this topic, and some of the points that I was going to talk about for this particular topic is mentioned in length, in detail in this article. So if you look at what Capcom has done with their remakes for the Resident Evil series, they have largely been successful. The weakest one is Resident Evil 3, and even that is still a good game. It's not a very good remake of the original, and the original is probably superior to the remake, but on its own, it's still, a good game. And last year, they knocked it out of the park with the Resident Evil 4 remake, which went on to be a Game of the Year nominee. And once again, that turned out to be my favorite game that came out last year. And there were a lot of great games that came out last year. So Capcom, at the end of the Resident Evil 4 remake, they left a teaser for the next Resident Evil remake. And they confirmed later after the game's release that they do intend to remake some of the other Resident Evil games. Judging from the game's teaser, in the form of a cutscene at the end of the Resident Evil 4 remake, it's clear that Capcom has the intention of doing a remake for Resident Evil 5. Now, Resident Evil 5, as many know, is the game that kind of started the decline within the Resident Evil franchise in terms of its quality. Now, when it comes to Resident Evil 5, I actually have a little bit of nostalgia for this game because it actually was my very first Resident Evil game. The very first one that I played was Resident Evil 5 when it released back in 2009. And generally, I actually like Resident Evil 5, but I understand why there are those that don't. I didn't have an issue with the co-op gameplay, aside from certain issues that would happen with the AI not doing what I wanted her to do. Of course, I'm referring to the character Sheva, who is controlled by the AI as your companion in the game. And as this article mentions, Resident Evil is a survival horror franchise, but Resident Evil 5 is more of an action game. Well, Resident Evil 4 is also more of an action game than it is a horror game. But both titles still fall within the category of survival horror. They're just more action-oriented than your typical survival horror experience. Another thing that the article mentions, correctly so, is that Resident Evil 5, regarding its level design, is more straightforward. Instead of having a level that has like a Metroidvania type of design, where new areas are opened up as you collect more key items, throughout the game, like the older Resident Evil games. Instead, you're given basically a straightforward path from, point A to point B, and you're funneled along that path. And all of this began with Resident Evil 4, and it was just continued in Resident Evil 5. And as far as I'm concerned, that's not really an issue, because Resident Evil 4 had that same type of design, and it wasn't an issue in that game. I didn't feel that was really the issue with Resident Evil 5. I think a greater problem with Resident Evil 5 is that it leaned a little bit too heavily into the action moments. So they had like turret sections, like right here in the game. That was an issue because, it turned the game more into a shooting gallery. And doing that just removed the horror elements, or at least it downplayed them a lot. There wasn't really any puzzle solving to be had. Any key items that you gathered in Resident Evil 5, the game basically gave those key items to you by default as part of the level, instead of you having to actually go and search for them. The game was heavily structured in how, the player would proceed through the levels. And the reason those classic elements of the older Resident Evil games had changed is because, Capcom wanted to move away from all the backtracking that, the player had to do. But at the same time, removing, those elements and streamlining, those classic elements to make the level design more straightforward That really removed the complexity of the level design and made the games more casual friendly. And of course, as the article mentions, they didn't go back to the classic style of the older Resident Evil games until Resident Evil 7 came out, which that game went back to the more classic, Metroidvania type of level design, and moving away from the stage driven structure, as the article mentions here, that started in Resident Evil 4 and continued through Resident Evil 6. Now, Capcom has a big issue. Actually, they have a few big issues in remaking a game like Resident Evil 5. Because of what the original game was, they have to find a balance. They have to strike a balance between old and new. But it's not just that. There were other issues that people had problems with Resident Evil 5, including its setting, which, this article also mentions. That game took place in Africa, and most of the zombies were black people. And some people felt a certain way about that, claiming that the game was racist because, you played as a white man and you were gunning down black people. As a black person, I personally don't agree with that. I didn't really have an issue with that because I understood that the game took place in Africa and there's a lot of black people in Africa, and so I didn't really view it as a racist thing, not to mention the villagers and whatnot that you encountered in Resident Evil 5 were infected. So it's not like Chris Redfield was gunning down, normal civilians. These were pretty much monsters that had been turned, such as this enemy right here that's attacking Chris in this screenshot. This particular part of the article is something I don't really agree with. I think this is just another case of, gaming journalists trying to find an argument and create a problem where there's not really a problem to be had. In Resident Evil 4, no one said anything when you were, gunning down Spanish people, right? So it shouldn't be an issue if they set the game again for a potential remake in Africa. And I wouldn't really want them to change the setting. I think there are certain things that should be kept intact for a potential remake. And the setting is something that I think worked in Resident Evil 5. So that's something I wouldn't really want them to change. But the biggest issue that Capcom's going to have is, as I mentioned earlier, is striking that balance between two different tastes of the overall, Resident Evil fan base. You have the OG fans who want more of a classic, survival horror style, a Metroidvania style from, the older games before Resident Evil 4. And then you have the newer fans who want more of the, action-oriented elements that was introduced and emphasized with Resident Evil 4 through 6. And considering that Resident Evil 5 is technically the best-selling game in the entire series, you don't want to alienate the fans of the original game, but you also don't want to alienate, the fans that have supported the newer entries, which have leaned more into the older style of the older games in the series. So the best solution, in my opinion, if Capcom were to remake Resident Evil 5, is to find a balance, strike a balance between the two different styles. So for example, in terms of what they should remove, the zombies carrying guns in combat and utilizing things like turrets and Gatling guns and all that, I think those were the worst parts, the worst gameplay sections of Resident Evil 5, and I think those parts should be cut out because those elements lean into the worst part of, the series from an overall quality perspective. Things that they should keep should definitely be the setting. They should retain the co-op element, but maybe make it to where, Chris and Sheva are separated a bit more for the newer version instead of them, being together throughout the entire game. There should be more moments where they have to separate. Sheva will have her own levels or whatever, and then Chris will have his own, sections that he has to go through, and then at times they'll, meet up, and then you'll play like a level together with them, and then they separate again. I think that would be the best way to handle that. That would also give Capcom the opportunity to, create some new content that, the older game didn't have. in terms of like them adding new levels that weren't in the original. They should obviously update, the mechanics to what's been seen in the remakes, not restricting the player and being unable to move, for example, when they're aiming at a target. The general movement should largely be the same as it was in the Resident Evil 4 remake. They could still keep the melee stuff in there as well, maybe make it a little bit more fluid than what it was in the original game. And all of the monsters and whatnot that appeared in the original Resident Evil 5, I think, should make a return. I think one of the best monsters from that game, the one that I remember the most, is the Reaper. I believe this was the most terrifying enemy from that game. They did a fantastic job with this particular monster. This creature and the lickers and different creatures that appeared, some of the bosses and everything that appeared in the original should make a return for a potential remake. Now, as far as what they should add from a gameplay perspective, there should be more puzzle solving, but the puzzle solving should be more in line to what you had in the Resident Evil 4 remake, and they should retain the stage-like structure that was in the original game. The Resident Evil 4 remake proved that, that particular style can be remade and updated for a modern experience, so they should retain that because that ultimately is what Resident Evil 5 was. That game was not a classic, Resident Evil title. It took after Resident Evil 4 in terms of how it was structured, and so the remake should be the same way. And finally, I think the biggest thing they should do, as IGN has mentioned here, the biggest thing they should do is probably do a full rewrite. But I think they should do a rewrite of the story while retaining some of the characters that appeared in the original. Particularly, I would like to see Sheva come back for the remake, but they emphasize her importance by giving her like a new story, like her own story or what have you. Give her more importance other than her just simply being Chris's partner in the game. Basically a subplot to the main plot. And as far as the main plot goes, I think they should just focus on rewriting the entire thing. Keep the same setting, keep the same characters that appeared in, the original game in terms of the protagonist, bring back Wesker, and they could even include more of Jill Valentine since she was in the original. Maybe give her her own gameplay sections. Expand the story, but rewrite it to where it's not as silly and ridiculous like it was in the original game. So I think ultimately that's the best direction that Capcom could go for a Resident Evil 5 remake. I know, as this article mentions, that a lot of people want to see Code Veronica remade. I don't really have an issue with them remaking Code Veronica, but I think that they're looking to remake Resident Evil 5 first, before even considering going back to remaking some of the older games. But a remake to Resident Evil 5, it would be a lot of work, but it's not at all impossible. They could take and pluck different things from the original game and add new things, keep some things that was in the original, and basically, mix and match the different styles of Resident Evil to come up with an overall satisfying product. A bigger problem would be if they were to try and remake Resident Evil 6. If they have the intention of remaking Resident Evil 6, they would have to basically remake the entire game, because that's how terrible Resident Evil 6 was and is. They would have to remake that entire game. Resident Evil 5 had its problems, but there are certain things that were good in that game that they should absolutely retain. And some of those things were like the co-op, the setting. Some of the bosses were, fun. The fight in that game. Some of the creatures, as I mentioned, were good additions to the series, such as the Reaper here. So that's what I would do if I was in Capcom's position and I was tasked with, a remake for Resident Evil 5. They don't have to remake the whole game. They could take some things from the original, basically rewrite the story, include some of the same characters, and once again mix and match, the two different styles of the franchise. We'll just have to see how it all turns out, but I'm fairly certain that Resident Evil 5 is going to be the next remake in the series.